Okay, so we're diving deep today into a rhyme that's probably been rattling around in everyone's brain since, like, forever.
Oh, yeah.
Humpty Dumpty.
That's Dumpty.
You guys sent in a ton of really cool articles about, the history and all the different meanings that people have come up with over the years. And
Yeah.
our mission today is to kind of peel back all those layers, see what's going on.
See what we can find underneath it all.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, what's the gooey center of this Humpty Dumpty mystery?
Yeah, and we've got theories here that involve everything from war to, maybe something a little bit more fragile.
Yeah. When you think about Humpty Dumpty, you almost always think of an egg, right?
Right.
Like perched precariously on a wall.
Yeah.
And what's really interesting to me is how many different stories people have kind of attached to these verses over time.
Oh, yeah.
It's such a simple rhyme.
Right.
But it's almost like a blank canvas for people to project their own interpretations onto.
Right.
That's what's so fascinating.
So let's unpack a few of these things.
Sure.
One of the first things that we came across a couple of these articles was that the phrase Humpty Dumpty was actually used back in the 15th century in England.
Oh, wow.
To describe somebody who was...
like a large person.
Yeah, a heavy-set person.
Uh-huh.
But it sounds like that's more just a linguistic kind of side note than like an actual origin of the rhyme, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of the general consensus among most scholars, is that while the phrase existed, the rhyme as we know it came much, much later.
Right.
So it's just an interesting little quirk. Yeah, a quirk of language more than anything.
But not really where the rhyme itself comes from.
Probably not the...
Probably not.
Yeah.
So let's get into some of the more... well-developed theories.
Okay.
One of the popular ones is this idea that Humpty Dumpty was a cannon.
Oh, yeah.
A big cannon used during the English Civil War.
Right.
And specifically during the defense of Colchester, which was in 1648. So, pretty dramatic stuff here, right?
Yeah. Yeah, this puts us right in the middle of the action.
Yeah.
Right in the thick of a historical conflict.
Yeah.
And, just for context, the English Civil War was fought between the royalists who supported King Charles I and the parliamentarians.
Yeah, so king versus the parliament.
Exactly.
Right.
And Colchester was this really important stronghold for the royalists.
Right.
And in 1648, it came under siege by the parliamentarian forces.
Okay.
So the story goes that there was this big royalist cannon, maybe nicknamed Humpty Dumpty just because of its size.
Yeah, the name does kind of lend itself.
It does have a certain ring to it, for something big and round.
Exactly.
So anyway, it was placed on the city wall near St. Mary's Church.
Okay, so we got Humpty Dumpty up on the wall.
That's right.
And then I'm guessing...
Things went badly.
Things went badly.
Right.
Yeah, so tell me, how did this Humpty Dumpty cannon meet its maker?
Well, the theory says that around July 14th or 15th of 1648, a parliamentarian cannon shot actually damaged the wall right under Humpty Dumpty.
Uh-oh.
Causing the cannon to tumble down.
Ah, there's our great fall.
A great fall indeed.
Okay.
Quite literally.
So all the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty together again.
Right. How do we explain that part?
Well,
you got to remember back then, cannons were massive.
Oh, yeah.
Like really heavy and hard to move, especially if they were damaged.
Right.
So all the king's men...
Meaning?
The royalist soldiers...
Right.
And even all the king's horses, meaning their cavalry...
Right.
Would have had a heck of a time trying to lift this thing back up.
Yeah.
Let alone repair it.
Right.
So,
Broken cannon.
Broken cannon can't be used anymore. Big loss for the royalists.
Yeah.
And some people say that this even contributed to the fall of Colchester to the parliamentarians.
Kind of a domino effect.
Yeah.
Starts with Humpty Dumpty the cannon.
Right.
Okay, so that's a pretty cool story.
It's a good one.
Yeah, linking this little kid's rhyme to like this big historical event. But one of the articles that you sent in pointed out that the first time we actually see this rhyme in print is around 1810, which is like 150 years after the Civil War.
That's a long time.
That's a long time.
For a story to just be floating around.
Yeah, for 150 years, people are just telling each other this rhyme, and nobody writes it down.
Nobody writes it down.
Yeah.
Before 1810.
It seems a little odd, right?
Yeah, I mean, that definitely raises questions.
Yeah.
About how directly connected they are.
Right.
I mean, a century and a half is a long time.
It is.
For a rhyme to survive purely through word of mouth.
Right.
And, on top of that, there's this guy, Albert Jacks.
Oh, okay.
Who in 2008 claimed that he had found...
He found what?
An older version.
An older version of the rhyme.
Yeah, a more detailed version of the rhyme that specifically mentions 1648 and the siege.
Wow.
It even had verses about a gunner called One-Eyed Thompson and all the details of the parliamentarian siege.
That's so specific.
Very specific.
Yeah.
But there were some problems with it.
Yeah, the article kind of hinted at that. Well, what were some of the red flags there?
Well, for one thing, the language. Okay. It just didn't sound right for the 17th century. Mm-hmm. You know, the sentence structure, the words he used, it felt much more modern.
Or like?
Yeah, like 19th or even 20th century.
Wow. Okay, so like somebody trying to sound old-timey, but not quite.
Not quite getting it right.
Yeah.
And then there's the fact that it was missing Dumpty in the last line.
Oh, interesting.
Which is, you know, a stylistic choice that came later.
Okay.
So that also made it seem less authentic.
Right.
And to top it all off, Albert Jack never actually produced this book. He never showed anybody this amazing discovery.
He just said he found it.
He just said, I have it. I found it in a dusty library somewhere.
Oh.
But nobody ever saw it.
So.
Makes you wonder.
A little sus.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's a good story, but maybe not.
Not quite holding up to scrutiny.
Yeah.
Under the magnifying glass.
Right, exactly. But one of the articles did mention that the Colchester Tourist Board.
Oh, really?
Actually, you know, latched onto this idea for a while.
Oh, interesting.
Back in the 90s.
So they were promoting this theory.
They were kind of promoting it, yeah.
To draw in tourists.
Yeah. And I guess they've kind of moved away from it since then.
Yeah, well, it does make sense.
And I thought it was interesting that Colchester put up one of those, you know, like those public information panels.
Oh, yeah, like a historical marker.
Yeah, like a historical marker, specifically to debunk the canon story.
Oh, wow.
In 2017.
They're taking their nursery rhyme history seriously.
They are. They're serious about Humpty Dumpty.
Good to see.
Yeah, so it just shows you how these rhymes can really capture people's imagination.
It really does.
Yeah, even if they're not always accurate.
Right. It's that connection to the past.
Right.
People love a good story.
Okay, so the canon theory.
It's fun, but...
It's fun.
Well, maybe not true.
But maybe not true. Yeah, a few too many holes in it.
Yeah.
So what else do we have as far as historical figures or events that might have inspired Humpty Dumpty?
Okay, so there's another prominent theory that came out in 1956.
Okay.
And it was proposed by this guy, David Dobb.
Okay.
And he suggested that Humpty Dumpty wasn't a cannon, but an armored siege engine.
What?
Called a tortoise.
A tortoise?
Yeah.
Okay, hold on. I'm having trouble picturing this. What is a siege engine tortoise?
Okay, so imagine like this big, wheeled, heavily armored shelter that was used to protect musketeers as they were approaching a city wall.
Okay.
Some of them even had like a built-in bridge.
Oh, wow.
To help them cross moats and stuff.
So like a big armored shed on wheels.
Basically, yeah.
To get up to the enemy.
Yeah, protect the soldiers.
That's cool.
As they're trying to storm the walls.
Wow, okay.
Yeah.
So in this theory, the Great Fall isn't really a fall from a wall.
Right.
It's more like the failure of this whole contraption
to
do its job. Yeah. Okay.
Dobb pointed to some historical accounts of the Siege of Gloucester, which happened in 1643.
Okay.
So a little earlier in the Civil War.
Right.
And apparently the defenders of the city, they widened and deepened the moat.
Oh, no.
So when the royalists tried to use their tortoise, it couldn't actually reach the wall.
It got stuck.
Yeah, it either got stuck or fell in the moat. Completely useless.
Oh, so there's your Great Fall.
There you go.
And how did he tie in the rest of the rhyme to that event?
Well, he said that the beck, in the version that says Humpty Dumpty lay in a beck,
right,
he thought that was the moat.
Okay.
Yeah, the wet moat.
Makes sense.
And the sinews round his neck.
Yeah, what about that part?
He thought that maybe that was like the ropes and coverings of the damaged siege engine.
So not literal sinews.
No, not literal sinews, more like...
More metaphorical.
Yeah.
Okay.
And there's even a version of the rhyme that mentions 40 doctors and 40 rights.
Oh, wow. I haven't heard that one.
Yeah, it's not as common. Okay.
But Dodd thought that referred to the engineers trying to fix the broken engine.
Like doctors for the machine?
Exactly.
Okay.
So it's all very...
It's very metaphorical.
It's very metaphorical.
No,
imaginative.
Yeah, and imaginative. But once again, it sounds like there's not a whole lot of historical proof.
Right. We run into that same problem of no direct evidence linking this specific event
with a rhyme
to the rhyme, and the fact that the rhyme appeared much later.
Way later.
Yeah, like way later.
Yeah, so...
And plus there's this idea that maybe Dobb was just joking.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
So he wasn't even serious about this?
Maybe not.
Oh.
Iona and Peter Opie, who are like the leading experts on nursery rhymes,
okay,
they thought his theory was a spoof.
Oh.
Like a clever, humorous take on the whole thing.
A little bit of an academic prank?
Maybe.
Yeah, okay.
So it's a very ingenious interpretation.
It is, but it faces the same challenges as the canon theory.
Right.
Timeline doesn't quite match up.
Yeah.
And it requires a lot of metaphorical interpretation. But what's interesting?
Oh, interesting.
This theory actually inspired an opera.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's called All the King's Men.
Wow. So even if it wasn't the original intention,
right,
it sparked some creativity.
Yeah. It definitely got people thinking.
Okay, so we've got a siege engine. Now let's move on to another theory with a royal connection.
Okay.
And this one is the idea that Humpty Dumpty actually represents King Richard III.
Oh, wow.
Who was defeated at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485.
Okay, yeah.
So this theory is really about like a fall from power.
Right, a king who can't be restored.
Exactly.
Okay.
So tell me, how do they make that connection?
So the idea is that Humpty Dumpty refers to Richard III's supposed hunchback.
Oh, okay.
Although historians now think it was more likely scoliosis.
Right, a curvature of the spine.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So not exactly a hunchback. But anyway, the wall in the rhyme is interpreted as his reign,
Okay.
the Great Fall, as his defeat and death at Bosworth Field. And then all the king's horses and all the king's men are his army who couldn't save him.
Right.
And people often bring up Shakespeare's play.
Oh, right.
Where Richard III is portrayed as hunchbacked.
Yeah, and he has that famous line.
Yeah, a horse my kingdom for a horse.
Exactly.
So those are seen as kind of supporting this theory,
Yes.
even though Shakespeare was writing much later.
Right.
And it was fictionalized.
And he took a lot of liberties.
He did.
With historical accuracy.
Yeah, for dramatic effect.
Yeah.
But it's interesting to note that this theory isn't brand new.
Right.
There's a book from the 1930s.
Oh, wow.
That actually put forward this idea.
Okay, what was that book?
It's called The Real Personages of Mother Goose.
Okay.
And it was written by Catherine L. West Thomas.
Right.
And she was a big proponent of this Richard III theory. She basically said that, Richard's physical difference, his status as a king with an army.
Right, the horses and the men.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And his defeat and death all kind of lined up.
With the rhyme.
Yeah.
But we run into that same problem again, right?
We do.
This huge gap between...
Hundreds of years.
Yeah, like 300 years
Right.
between when this actually happened and when the rhyme shows up.
Right. And on top of that,
Yeah.
the oldest versions of the rhyme,
Yeah.
they don't even mention a king or horses.
It's just a guy.
It's just Humpty Dumpty.
Humpty Dumpty having a bad day.
Yeah. And a lot of people trying to help him.
Yeah.
And then later on, the royal elements were added in.
Oh, so it could have just been
Yeah.
embellished over time?
Exactly.
Okay.
And, it's worth pointing out that while Richard III did have scoliosis,
Right.
he wasn't really described as having a hunchback during his lifetime.
Okay.
That image mostly came about later.
Like through propaganda.
Yeah, exactly.
From the people who defeated him.
Right. So that connection to Humpty Dumpty is also a bit shaky.
Yeah, it's kind of like people looked at the rhyme and said, oh, this must be Richard III.
Right.
Let's make him a hunchback.
Exactly.
Even though he wasn't really.
Right.
Okay, so it seems like every time we try to connect this to a historical event, we run into the same problems.
Yeah, the evidence isn't really there.
The evidence isn't really there.
And the timeline is way off.
Yeah, and so that brings us to what seems like the most likely theory.
Okay.
Which is that Humpty Dumpty isn't a person or a canon or a king.
Mm-hmm.
He's something much simpler, and that the rhyme is actually a riddle.
Okay, so what's the answer?
The answer is an egg.
Oh, an egg.
And this theory actually has a lot of historical support.
Does it?
It does, yeah. Back in 1813,
Okay.
just a few years after the rhyme was first printed, it was described as a riddle, sometimes offered to children.
Okay.
And by the 1820s and 30s,
Right.
it was being referred to directly as a riddle.
Like a well-known riddle.
Yeah, like everybody knew that this was a riddle.
So people back then already understood it as an egg.
Yeah, and there's even more evidence to suggest that people knew the answer was an egg.
Like what?
So, for example, in 1832,
Okay.
there was a pantomime.
Pantomime.
Yeah, like a stage show called Humpty Dumpty, or the Enchanted Egg.
Oh, wow.
And then in 1835, a version of the rhyme was published, and it actually said the answer.
Oh, so they gave it away.
Yeah, it said, this nursery rhyme upon an egg.
Wow.
And then it gave an explanation of what it all meant.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. And then even later in the 19th century, some publications would actually print an egg in brackets.
Like before the rhyme.
Before the rhyme. Like, here's the answer.
Wow.
Now try to figure it out.
Okay, that's pretty clear.
So it really seems like this was a common riddle.
Right. So if it's a riddle about an egg, then that explains why the rhyme doesn't actually say the word egg.
Yeah, that's the whole point of a riddle.
Right. You're supposed to figure it out.
Yeah.
But what about that image of the egg on the wall?
Yeah, that seems a little weird.
It does seem a little strange.
Why would an egg be on a wall?
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't make literal sense, but that's where the language of riddles comes in. Okay. They often use these metaphors and imagery to create a scene that's not really realistic.
So, like, you wouldn't actually find an egg on a wall?
Probably not.
Yeah.
But back in the day, before refrigerators, people did sometimes store eggs on windowsills.
Oh, okay.
Or even on walls.
To keep them cool.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it's not completely out there.
Right.
And, Lewis Carroll, through the looking glass, when he first introduces Humpty Dumpty, he's just a regular egg sitting on a shelf.
Oh, okay.
Before he turns into this, big talking character.
Right, right.
So even Carroll played with that idea of an egg just being an egg.
Just an ordinary egg.
Yeah.
Okay, and what about that whole all the king's horses and all the king's men thing?
Right, because that seems a little over the top.
Yeah, a little bit much.
Yeah.
For a simple egg, right?
Right. I mean, it's not like they would actually send out the whole army
to fix a broken egg.
Yeah, but again, this is a riddle.
Right.
So we have to think about it figuratively.
Okay.
It's a way of emphasizing how fragile an egg is.
Right.
And how once it's broken, you can't put it back together.
You can't fix it.
Nope.
Yeah.
It's like saying even the best doctors in the world couldn't save this person.
Oh, okay.
It's about the irreversibility of the damage.
Right.
So the king's forces, they just represent ultimate power.
Like they could do anything.
Exactly.
But they still can't fix a broken egg.
That's the point.
Yeah.
Even with all that power, some things just can't be undone.
Okay, I like that.
Yeah.
Now, there's another version of the rhyme.
Oh, okay.
That one of the articles mentioned. It says, Humpty Dumpty lay in a beck with all his sinews round his neck.
Oh, yeah, that one.
How does the egg riddle work with that one?
So the word beck is thought to be a dialect word for a stream.
Okay.
Or maybe even just a sink or a wash basin.
It's like at a kitchen.
Yeah,
Like
and an egg falling into water.
Makes sense.
Yeah, it happens.
Yeah, it happens.
So that part's easy.
Right.
The sinews around his neck. That's a bit more poetic.
Yeah, what is that about?
Well, some people think it's describing a poached egg.
Oh!
You know how the egg white kind of surrounds the yolk?
Right.
It's like it's clinging to it?
Yeah.
Maybe that's what they meant by sinews.
So if you poach an egg, you can see those sinews.
Yeah, you can kind of see those superfluous adherings.
I'm going to have to try that.
Yeah, it's an experiment.
Science in the kitchen.
Exactly.
Okay, so this riddle theory seems to answer a lot of the questions.
It does.
That we've had about the other theories.
It kind of clears things up.
Yeah, it brings the focus back to the rhyme itself.
Right.
As like a word puzzle.
Yeah, a play on words.
Yeah.
Instead of trying to tie it to some historical event.
And it fits with what we know about how people entertained themselves back then.
Right, riddles were popular.
Yeah.
Especially for kids. So it makes sense that a nursery rhyme would be a riddle.
Now, there's one more thing before we wrap this up that I wanted to touch on.
Yeah.
One of the articles mentioned this book called A Classical Dictionary of the Vulgar Tongue.
Oh, wow.
By Francis Gross.
Okay.
It's from 1785.
Okay.
And in this book, it defines Humpty Dumpty
as
either a short, clumsy person or ale that's been boiled with brandy.
What?
Yeah. So
Humpty Dumpty the drink.
Humpty Dumpty the drink, or Humpty Dumpty.
Or the clumsy person.
The clumsy person. So could that be a clue
That's
for where the rhyme came from?
I mean, it's really interesting that the term existed even before the rhyme became popular. And it seems like it already had this kind of comical connotation.
Yeah.
So maybe the rhyme just took this existing phrase and built a story around it.
Yeah.
But it's not clear why there's a wall or a fall.
Or why nobody can put them back together.
Yeah, those elements don't really connect to being short or clumsy or a drink.
Right.
So it's a bit of a mystery.
Okay, so it's a possible connection, but not a complete explanation.
Right.
But there's one more person we can't forget.
Who's that?
Lewis Carroll.
Oh, of course.
And his book, Through the Looking Glass,
Right.
which came out in 1871.
Yeah.
He's the one who really cemented the image of Humpty Dumpty as this big talking egg.
Sitting on a wall.
Sitting on a wall.
Yeah.
And I know for me, that's how I always pictured him.
Me too.
As a kid, it was always a literal egg
Right.
on a wall I never even considered it could be something else.
I mean, it's hard to imagine him any other way now.
Yeah, Carol really shaped how we see Humpty Dumpty.
He did. And, you know, even though the riddle idea was around before him, Carol's depiction really solidified it.
Yeah, because everyone knows.
Everybody knows that image.
The egg on the wall.
Right.
So it's a good example of how a book can change how we understand.
Yeah.
Like folklore and nursery rhymes.
Definitely.
So as we come to the end of our deep dive into Humpty Dumpty, it's clear that there's more to this rhyme than meets the eye.
Yeah, a lot more.
We've looked at all sorts of possibilities, from war machines to falling kings.
And even a clumsy person.
Yeah, or weird drink.
Right.
But it seems like the most likely explanation is that it's a riddle.
Yeah, a clever riddle about a fragile egg.
Yeah. And it's fascinating how this simple rhyme has inspired so many different interpretations.
It really has.
Over the years. And, you know, the fact that you guys sent in so many articles about this just shows that people are still really intrigued.
Yeah, they want to know.
By Humpty Dumpty.
Where did he come from?
Yeah.
What does he mean?
What does he mean?
Yeah.
And so, I guess as a final thought for our listeners to ponder.
Okay.
Do you think knowing the potential origins of the rhyme, whether it's a historical event or a clever riddle, does that make you enjoy the rhyme more or less?
Does it change how you feel about it?
Yeah. Does it change how you feel about it, or does it even matter?
Right.
Yeah, because I think it says something about us as humans.
Oh, yeah.
That we want to know.
We want answers.
The answer.
You want to solve the mystery.
Even for something as silly as a nursery rhyme.
Like, why do we need to know where it came from?
Yeah, maybe the real meaning of Humpty Dumpty isn't about finding the one right answer.
Right.
It's about all the questions that it makes us ask.
Yeah.
So think about that.
Food for thought.
Food for thought.
Next time you hear Humpty Dumpty.